Take it away, Bill.
And the most important words are last speaker, right? I got to say that I don't have the least envious slot in the program. Tom just did. Next to last is worse than last. I once gave a talk, I told a couple of you this in some of the sessions, that it was an economics conference, and it was the very last session of the conference. It was like 11 o'clock on a Saturday, and not far from this slot, and there were 3 people in the room, the 3 presenters. That was it. True story. Then the first presenter presented his paper while the 2 of us listened, and then he said, I got to go to the airport and I have to leave. So we're a little better than that. I'm hopefully enticed by box lunch and the like. So I don't know if it's a curse or a compliment. The only other worse one that was up there was I had given, it was an academic talk with equations and everything else, and the guy before me, this was in a conference in Wiesbaden in Germany, was the guy who introduced the Mini Cooper for BMW, and he had a car in the room with music, and I had to go after this guy. It's like, no. I do have to say something about the slides. You'll notice that this is an academic talk, and you don't even have to look at the person or know anything other than by looking at the black and white slides and the like to know it's an academic talk. And there's a reason why I say that, and there's a reason why I have to reference my attire. There's one guy besides me in the room with a tie, and you don't count because you have a sweater. A little preface is I spent 6 years in London, and I just can't present without a tie. In London, 2 people in the room actually. This is business casual and informal in London, so I don't have a choice but to do this. The reason why I reference attire is there are basically going to be 4 main principles that I'm going to talk to that will underscore much of what the next set of slides will address. And first is personal and prior experiences. Second, external conditions. Third, peers and peer input. And then finally, the use of new information and what that does. And the reason why I start there is I have a colleague who tells a story, and usually what he does, apparently, when he gets dressed in the morning, is he goes and looks at those external conditions. He thinks he's a really smart dresser, and he dresses really well. So he uses the personal experiences of his past, which tells him he's a great dresser, and the fact that it was raining outside, that additional information from those external conditions to go out and decide what he's wearing for the day. And then apparently, quite often, he walks into the kitchen where his wife is, the peer, and she says to him, "Oh, that's what you're wearing." And he turns around, goes back, and puts something else on, the new information that changes what he does. And so that story, in many ways, is something that we're going to relate to using some econometric techniques, and in particular, the context of adolescent marijuana use. Now, with that said, I'm going to give a bunch of examples, and the examples that I'll give will be broader than marijuana use, but the empirical application, use data from Partnership for Drug-Free America on adolescent drug use. Now, the reason why, in part, I told the story I just did is in the current issue of Wired magazine, if you ever get a chance to look at it. I think it's really good because it does speak to a talk and also what you would write in an academic article or say in a book. And what they did is list what they call the anatomy of a winning talk. And this was in the context of TED, but I think it can fit anywhere. So 1% sophisticated visual aids. Now, I may or may not have that in this talk. An opening joke. That was the requisite opening joke, right? That's the 5% of a winning talk. Spontaneous moment. That was me talking a little bit about the econ conference and being last in the program. Statement of utter certainty. Everything I say from here on will be statements of utter certainty. Even if they're not correct, they'll be statements of utter certainty. I don't know about the snappy refrain or personal failure, but the point that I think was most telling about this sort of list is the Contrarian Thesis. And the Contrarian Thesis in a talk, particularly in TED, is what really gets your attention. So I'm going to start out with a couple of fairly basic and simple contrarian theses. And the first is the more we know, the less we know. So in particular, the more we think we know, the less we actually do. And that's going to be something that will pervade experts' decisions, experts' predictions of what they're going to do in the future versus novices. The second contrarian is experts aren't experts, at least when it pertains to themselves. So the more we think we know about ourselves, at least in the context that we study here, actually the less we know about ourselves. So with that said, we often behave contrary to our predictions. So the example that often people throw up, the anecdotal evidence, is in gym membership, for example, $55 a month. It's a $30 billion industry, yet some studies show that 2/3 of those that use how many of you, by the way, are guilty of this? Buy a gym membership and don't use it? All right, how many of you are guilty of it but don't want to admit that you're guilty of it and won't admit it to yourself, right? And in part, that's what this talk is about. The fact that we don't admit to ourselves what we do, and in many cases, we can't accurately predict what we're going to do in the future because we deny some of what it is as we think ahead to our future. All right. So the inability, part of this is going to be the inability to predict a hot state versus a cold state. And the work of Lowenstein, which was mentioned in the previous talk, and by the way, maybe we should do this in dim lighting and bright lighting and see what it does to marijuana usage. So the example might be a recovering gambling addict that sits there at his hometown, or his or her hometown, and feels, I got this thing under control, until he goes with his buddies to Vegas and sits there at the craps table and all of a sudden realizes, hey, maybe I don't. That's the hot state. Someone who is trying to diet and thinks, I got it, I've been really good. Then I go to the all-you-can-eat buffet, and all of a sudden I realize in that hot state I may eat more than I think I was going to do. That's the kind of thing. It's not the only part of what we'll be looking at. So there is empirical evidence from experimental studies and a whole host of anecdotal evidence. The gym membership, the example of people who gamble too much or drink too much is an example. There are very few empirical studies based on either real or reported data that are analyzed in great detail that we can start to think and understand what explains the differences between what we think we're going to do, i.e. what we predict we'll do in the next year, and what we actually do over the course of that next year. Hence the subject of what we'll be doing here. So this is more than just forecasting. It's about the role it's setting, things like situation, perceptions of severity of your actions, perception of our own ability to control what we do, and prior use. So if we use more or less, what impact does that have on our ability to predict? The literature suggests that experts actually can do a better job forecasting. We actually show just the opposite, that experts do a much poorer job on average, and it's actually asymmetric to those that are low volume users. I will say as we move ahead in at least the context that we're addressing, we're going to differentiate between non-users and users. So this part of what I'm going to talk about today is only focused on those that have used marijuana in the past in the adolescent 12 to 17 age categories. I'm going to suggest that at least the approach we take, the econometric approach we take, can be used in a variety of settings, and I'll go through them as we work through the session. So again, our realm is teenage misprediction of future marijuana use. How many of you have teenage kids? I have a 16-year-old. So when I started thinking about this and I talked with him about how I frame it, the only thing I didn't think about to talk to him was about make sure when you go to school, you do it in dim lighting or whatever. All right. So marijuana use is an important problem. Again, this talk isn't limited to this, but I at least want to frame the empirical analysis. Number one illicit drug choice amongst teens in the past 3 years. When I talk to my 16-year-old, he says, you go into the bathroom and the smell, you can't miss it. In the bathroom at school, in a local high school in Chapel Hill. So it's not unusual, as you know. 1.5 million teens smoked pot heavily in 2012, greater than 20 times in the past month, at least according to national statistics. 40% of all teens have tried. 71% of teens say they have friends who use pot regularly, consistent with my son's reporting of not his friends, he claims, I hope, but people he knows at school. And this is the part that may be the most disturbing because it'll be part of our empirical analysis, is that perceived severity of drug use is down just 50%. So that is, if they ask teens, how severe do you think is the act of taking or smoking marijuana, 50% of them say it's no big deal. It's no different than having a beer or something else. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of teaser of the results. I'll talk a little bit about the methodology, then some of the implications, and then talk about what we might be able to do to think about other kinds of behaviors that are along these same lines. 58%, or almost 59%, ended up using marijuana more than they thought they would. So the actual was greater than the prediction for 58% of them. On the other hand, 21% ended up using less. So what they actually used in that ensuing year was less than they thought they would. And much of what we're trying to understand here is why. Is there a systematic reason why some overpredict and some underpredict? Is it heavy users versus light users? Is it situational factors, inner city, urban, non-urban, male, female? Okay? All right. So, 4 basic questions. How do teens' prediction of future marijuana use compare with actual? Does it change as a function of prior use? What situation and attitudinal factors cause the misprediction, and what are the public policy implications? Aside to this, a 5th one is going to be what are the implications for other settings? And I'll come to that at the end. All right? So, given that said, I'm going to go through this really quickly about tracking studies. We see all these numbers. Much of it is sponsored by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the federal government, and other agencies that do this. Probably the one that is used most frequently is the Partnership for Drug-Free America tracking study, or PATS. We published data in 2002 in the American Journal of Public Health that traced the effectiveness of anti-drug advertising. And what we showed, it actually was effective for reducing the first-time trial of marijuana, but not effective in decreasing the usage, or decreasing the usage of marijuana, given those have tried. We also tested things like the gateway theory, and hence the question I asked you guys, because we had a different sample. But we tested the impact, or the theory, as many claim, that trying marijuana leads to harder drugs. And we show that actually there's evidence for that, but once you take into account the fact that those that try marijuana are exactly those same type of individuals that would try harder drugs in the first place, the gateway effect disappears. And I think it's one of the, to me, I believe it, I'm biased here, of course, but it makes, it give you an idea of what these studies can be used for. All right, so we look at 2 waves. I'm not even going to present the time frame. This is now, we're sending it back out, hopefully next week to JMR. It's 2 waves, and I need to say a little bit about the structure of the waves, because it makes us jump through some pretty difficult econometric hurdles to make it actually work in a way that we can compare actual and predicted. So we can't actually use reported data for a variety of reasons, not just sample mortality and attrition. We actually have to use predicted values and look at the differences and do it in a reasonably detailed fashion. So anyway, let me go through this. This is kind of the structure, if you will. We have actual last year in wave 1, and then they predict what they do next year. And then we get wave 2 data that reports on what they did the previous year. And so essentially what we look at is this group in here. So what do they predict next year prospectively? And then a year later, what do they do last year retrospectively? Okay? All right. So what we do is we look in some sense and track differences. So this is a hypothetical example of the difference between actual and predicted for any one individual over time. And it varies. And we want to understand, using a choice model, what impacts the path of this difference function. And I'm going to go through this super quickly. Basically, we use a discrete choice model based in utility theory that builds on Lowenstein's work and incorporates both an economic utility maximization and the framework of hot state, cold state to develop a model that we estimate econometrically. So I go through that, apply to the Partnership for Drug-Free America, and I basically said all that. The last point, though, is any situation, I would argue, that involves a hot state, cold state, and involves understanding what we can do to influence the difference between what we think we're going to do and what we do, and you could think about the settings where that might apply, the framework would, I think, easily apply. Dependent variables, to give you some idea, how many times in the last 12 months? It's a monthly weighted average, so the figures you're about to see in a little while are per month, but it will be over the last 12 years, so we looked at both predicted and then actual, and what determines and influences actual versus predicted behavior. And we look in particular at the situational attitudinal factors. Those are some of the independent variables we use, some of the control variables. I'm going through this super quickly so I don't have to show equations, because the last thing you all would ever want right before lunch in the last session are a bunch of detailed equations. But for For those of you that want to know, we basically go through 3 steps. Use an ordered probit, assess mispredictions, and then on the difference, we use a meoprobit to estimate those differences. For those of you that makes sense, that's great. For those of you who don't, let's move on to the next slide. All right, distribution of misprediction. So what is interesting, what this is these are the categories of how often they have so they smoke pot per month. And if they predict higher by 1 category, it's all done categorically because that's the way the data is reported, 75% of them are off by 1 category. In this case, 1 of them predict higher, only 1 in the sample predict higher by 5 categories. They're just way off. And that obviously is an anomaly. Okay, so if you think about it though, these are experts, those that tried. So at least for what I'm presenting here, we look only at those that have stated that they've tried marijuana in the past. It turns out, by the way, that those that say they haven't had marijuana in the past do a really good job predicting their future behavior. A year later, they say they hadn't used marijuana in the last year. 99% of them are accurate, so there's not a lot interesting there. So why do experts mispredict, and what do we mean by that? So a couple things. Regular drug users appear to be more overconfident in their ability to predict, and as a result, they dismiss situational and attitudinal factors. So people think it's a big deal. They say, oh, it's not a big deal. I can control my own behavior. Heavier users seem less willing to admit themselves how much they actually do. We read anecdotal evidence, right? So how many people report that they don't roll over credit card debt every month, that they pay it off in time, and then you look at the actual numbers that do, it's about half that. We don't admit, especially if we are habitual in an area, our own actions and our own behavior. Does the amount of prior drug consumption have a role to play in the extent of misprediction? And this is the part that's the contrarian part, because it runs counter to the forecasting work on experts' ability to predict future behavior. And what we find is, what this is this is the actual use from low to high, and this is the error in that prediction. So the negative means I actually consume less, I consume more than I said I thought I would. So those that smoke a lot underpredict what they actually do, actually by a lot. And we've gone through, for those of you familiar with the regression to the mean effects, we've gone through process checks in some detail, and regression to the mean effects actually would make our conclusions stronger. So as you consume more, your error is higher by a large margin, and indeed you start to deny the fact that you are smoking as much as you do. And it's consistent throughout the sample condition and for controls. All right, so I'm running out of time here. I'm going to go through this really quickly. Low users tend to overpredict future use and actually do so by a wider margin. So those that do low, they actually think that smoke a little bit, think they're going to do more pot in the future than they actually do. Come back to here, a couple public policy implications, and I'm going through this in the interest of time pretty quickly. Low volume users, one of the implications is that they be educated about the power of peer influence and severity of the drug problem. And I'll give you an example of what we mean by that. I'll skip over this one to give you an example. So don't even try it if it's in your own house. It's about the context and condition that is a way of influencing perceptions of situational effects that can have a huge effect on both low volume and high volume users, but particularly on low volume users, since high volume users don't pay any attention to any of this. So if we think about what it is that we can do in the messaging we send to teens, it's going to be very different for high users versus low users. And actually there is a systematic place we find high users versus low users, at least by data in the sample. So it's addressable. A couple other points I'll give you. You can read that really quickly. The administration, you can pick administration going back the last 30 years. I don't care. Republican, Democrat, whatever administration, none of them have done a great job on this. And so you could sort of read that quote, which I think is a good one. All right, I am about a minute or two towards the end. In short, there's a denial effect. The denial effect is greater the greater the prior marijuana use in the past. Not surprising. So you got to look at what you do differently for high versus low volume users. High volume generally I can stop whenever I want to, and hence the messaging should be quite differently. Probably the most important implication, I would argue, is the methodology that we've applied can be applied in a variety of other situations. So examples, healthy foods and diet. Expert dieters overestimate willpower. There's data out there to look at the two in health studies that you could actually compare using wave 1, wave 2, and that means I have 4 minutes including questions. So, oops, there. If I could hit the timer, I will. Second, exercise behavior. There's, again, good health data out there in the health fields that look at what people do in actually exercising versus what they say they will do and what we can do to sell equipment, gym memberships, or other things in healthy living, healthy living. Smoking behavior, charity giving, contributions to the IRA, to an IRA, there's a show out there, if you all see ABC News, What Would You Do? That is one where we can start to think about the implications of this. I put 2 on there that we've talked about this week, indulgence in Starbucks, and then the second is purchaseonguilt.com, since we had presenters earlier this week that talked about that, and what one does in predicting how they'll behave, and how we can influence it via situational factors, recognize prior use, and influence attitudes depending upon prior behavior has a huge difference depending upon who we're talking about. Now, I've gone through that pretty quickly on purpose, but the idea here is that in the case of marijuana, prior use matters. Heavy users say I can control it and don't. They overestimate their willpower. Low users actually underestimate the impact of severity, attitudinal, and situational factors. By influencing those vis-a-vis advertising, messaging, controls, intervention policies, we can have a significant impact on low volume users' consumption as well. All right, that's sort of the real short version. And I was trying to get done early for you all. I know we got box lunches and travel, but I think we have a couple minutes for, okay.
Did you look at the self-perception of current use? Because if someone's a heavy user and doesn't think it's a big deal, they may be more likely to underpredict than someone who's a heavy user and is not comfortable with it.
Yeah, it's funny because there have been studies that have looked at actually measuring things like using blood tests and looking at how these two compare. And the issue is in many ways trying to discern the systematic difference between stated use and actual use. What we have not done is, this is a pure stated measure. And to the extent that stated in actual versus stated in predicted are not systematically different, we're fine. To the extent that there's a systematic difference in reporting, this is not something that at least the data in this case addresses. Yeah.
Isn't there some cognitive impairment with marijuana use?
Yeah.
Would they be less effective at predicting
anything? That's a fair comment, yeah. Well, especially you see some of these 40 times a month, that's like more than once a day. And it may very well be there's, that's fair. Yeah.
But the opposite is that people are generally very poor at remembering what they do as a random activity in almost anything.
Yeah.
But if you ask people how many times they make a telephone call or how many times they do almost any general daily activity or even weekly activity, they'll misrepresent it up and down for various reasons.
But the interesting, so I agree entirely. To me, at least, the interesting thing here is it's actually pretty systematic. And so we could explain a good portion of what those differences are based on prior use, on attitudinal and situational perceptions. And that is, to me, the interesting part.
I've seen multiple presentations on teen marijuana use. I'm curious if you see the same interest in teen alcohol use.
Yeah. It's an interesting question because I personally haven't. I've seen as much interest in teen smoking behavior, and actually probably more so on smoking behavior than on marijuana use, but not in teen alcohol use. And it could be I just haven't seen it and people in the room have, but I would agree with your perception. And it may very well be a bigger issue in the long run, or even in the short run. All right, we got lunch, thanks.